The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is our Tits Out Festive Holiday Spectacular, super special. I was looking back at all of the past episodes a while ago for various reasons, and I remembered that the last 2 years I've had this festive Tits Out holiday, super special, spectacular, and I was like, that's a tradition I would like to maintain. So although last week was the finale of the truly unstoppable International season, this is a super special. And the last two super specials, the first one was Lettice Knowles, and then last year was Princess Cecilia of Sweden. And both of those, as I recall, had a connection to this time of year. I think one of them, like that was around when their birthday was, and one of them that was like around, well, that was when Princess Cecilia's whole Vedstina Bullrit, that happened in December. So like things happen in their lives that were timely. And this episode is it's a Hanukkah episode, frankly, because this is airing during the celebration of Hanukkah. And I've been wanting to do a Tits Out Jewish Woman for quite a while. I sent out a specific request to the brigade several months ago, just asking for suggestions of Jewish women. And I got some suggestions specifically from a Tits Out Brigade member who I only know their first initial is R. And R had various suggestions of people that fit the bill as Tits Out Jewish Women. And this one, as I am going to, the story called out to me just because of the tits out-ishness of it all, but also because as I started looking into the story, there are a stunning amount of tie-ins to past Vulgar History episodes, not just international ones, but other ones too. Like I keep all my notes for all the episodes in a series of documents, and I was like, wait, I know that name. And I was Googling, I'm like, yeah, I was in that episode. And that was an episode. There's even a moment where like a Roman emperor is mentioned. And I was like, which one is that? And I'm like, fuck me. It has to do with like the Agrippina story. So this is in that way. First of all, it's a tits out Jewish women. Couldn't be happier to be sharing that story. Also, it's a Hanukkah special. And also to people who, like, these are going to be like Easter eggs for people who've listened to every episode of Vulgar History, especially recently, maybe. I know that there's always new listeners, and some of them get in touch with me to let me know that they like binge through all of the episodes. Can you hear Hepburn? She's really excited for this story. She is purring, chewing on things very loudly close to me. Anyway, so there's going to be, if you've heard all the episodes of Vulgar History, you'll be like, oh my God, what? Another connection? And if this is the first episode of Vulgar History you've ever heard, then these will be sort of like little trailers for you of past episodes that you can look forward to listening to. And honestly, I was thinking if you wanted to listen to Vulgar History the way that you play the card game Dominion, which is a card game where there's all different cards and you put out, I think it's like 10 cards or something each game, but like which 10 cards it is really affects the way that the gameplay goes and the way that the game goes. So it's like different combinations, like when you assemble the cards differently, it makes a different experience of the game. And so one could put together all the episodes that I've mentioned in this episode and make your own little Vulgar History experience of just all the people I mentioned in the Doña Gracia Nasi episode and make your own little season. Anyway, yes, so thank you again to Tits Out Brigade member R for suggesting the story and answering my request for Tits Out Jewish Women. And thank you to friend of the podcast, Alison Epstein, for suggesting some reading for me so I could learn more about Renaissance era anti-Semitism and stereotypes, because that was something I really wanted to understand before I spoke about it on the podcast. I also listened to some Jewish history themed podcasts that both have really interesting episodes about Doña Gracia Nasi. So one of them is called A Deeper Conversation, the podcast for Jewish women. And then the other podcast is called The Jewish Story. So I'll put both of those links in the show notes because those are good. Add to your repertoire of podcasts you listen to about different kinds of people. The references for this podcast. So I looked at an article from the Jewish Museum in London, an article from the Jewish Women's Archives by Miriam Bodian, an article from the Museum of Jewish Heritage, an article on headstuff.org by Kieran Conliffe, Wikipedia, as per ever, a website called etzion.org by Rav Aviad Tabori, and an article from Aish.com by Dr. Yvette Alt Miller. So here we go. And I will also mention there's going to be, this first section is called, because I always put sections in my notes to remember what each section is about. Anyway, so this is called Backgroundy Stuff. Jews in Spain in the Middle Ages 101. So if you want to skip ahead, we will put a timestamp in the show notes. So you can, if you want to skip ahead this like history of anti-Semitism in Spain and just get to like Gracia's story, please do. But for those who want to hear this, here's some context about what's been going on. Because we're going to be going over some stuff that we have talked about in previous episodes, but just from this new direction. So if you want to put the episodes together, as I suggested, in a Dominion-like listening experience, I would suggest starting off with Isabella I of Castile. Then you can listen to the episode on Saida al-Hura, and then Harem Sultan, because this is all happening in and around some of the events from all of those episodes. Namely, remember that time when the Catholic monarchs, aka Isabella and Ferdinand, launched the Reconquista, which is when they decided to kick all of the non-Catholics out of Spain, often in murder-genocide manner. So we'll go back a bit further for the full context of the Jewish experience in Spain in the Middle Ages, because it's a much longer story than just Ferdinand and Isabella, frankly. Actually, I'm just opening up my other spreadsheet that I keep, my like increasingly long spreadsheet of people who we've talked about on the podcast and when they lived and like who overlapped with who, just so I can remember where exactly this story fits in. So, Jewish people had been living in, so we talked about this a whole bunch in the, I think in the Saida al-Hura episodes where I was explaining about like the Iberian Peninsula, which is like the big square landmass, which in modern times contains Spain and Portugal. But in oldie times was called Al-Andalus during the time when it was an Islamic kingdom. But Jewish people had been living in Spain since something like the year 70 AD. So, a long time. Following the Islamic conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the early 8th century, Jewish people were able to live and practice their religion as long as they paid taxes, because we talked about that a bit in the Harem Sultan episode when we're talking about the Ottoman Empire, which will come up again. But it seems to me, having studied now like 2 periods in history when there was a Muslim kingdom, like Muslim kingdoms tend to be like pretty chill about other religions. Living there as long as they paid their taxes, they weren't trying to like change anyone's religion or forcibly convert them. Isabel and Ferdinand could have learned from them. Anyway, so as the centuries went on, eventually who was there? It was like the Visigoths and the Goths. This is like, there's the podcast, the Spanish Arpada, which is the podcast where they are looking at all of the rulers of Spain from the beginning of Spain until now. So it really, it's changed hands a lot. Like when Ferdinand and Isabella came in and they're like, let's make Spain Catholic again. It's like, well, yeah, it was Catholic at one point, but it's also been other things. It's not just one thing. Anyway. But yeah, so Catholics started taking over more and more of the Iberian Peninsula. There was tolerance for Jews because they had crucial roles in banking and finance. And so although, their religion was like not Catholic people's favorite, but the Jewish people were important. They were financially, economically important. And the amount of tax that they paid was good for the economy because they were rich people. So a side note on money lending. Throughout history, there have been rich Jews and there have been poor Jews and there have been in between. And some of the Jewish people in history became money lenders, which is people who would, like today, what banks do. Like you can borrow money, but there's going to be interest on them. And when you borrow money and there's interest on it, that's what's called usury, U-S-U-R-Y. Which is a thing, like lending money with interest rates was forbidden in the Bible to Christians because something the Bible says, and maybe you know better than I do, it says a couple times in the Bible, basically, thou shalt not charge interest on loans. So Christians were not allowed to have this job, but people needed money. So Jewish people were kind of shunted into this job because Christians needed the service, but they didn't want to like damn themselves to hell by doing it themselves. So like someone had to, and Jewish people were like, okay, I guess we will. So there's other added facts because most Jewish people weren't allowed to own land in most European countries for a variety of reasons. And some of them just didn't want to own land. Like there was a desire to live more communally, but then also there was discriminatory taxes, etc. So Jewish people in like the Middle Ages tended to be city dwellers, which meant that they couldn't get jobs as like farmers because they were living in the cities. So they had to make their trade in city-based things like finance, trade, commerce. Also, add to that, Jewish people tended to be more literate and educated than the general population because reading is such an important part of the cultural tradition. Like, so they tended to go into like, quote, white collar jobs more than your average Christian, proportionately. So there were and continue to be stereotypes about Jewish people as these like evil money lenders, these like rich people who are like predatory. So if you think about some famous stereotypes of this are like Fagin from Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Is he a moneylender or he's just kind of like an evil Jewish person who like has a child army of thieves sort of thing? Shylock in The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. So this is a stereotype that exists, and I wanted to mention that because the Jewish family in this story do work as moneylenders, as did a lot of Jewish people in this era. So we're looking at one specific family story. Their job happened to be money lending. So I just wanted to put that in the context. So we're continuing on with the like anti-Semitism of it all. From 1350 till 1365, the King of Castile was a guy named Pedro I, aka Pedro the Cruel. And this tweaked my memory. So I was like, wait, Pedro the Cruel was not Pedro from Inez and Pedro, also aka Pedro the Cruel. But in my notes then, I said like there was another king also called Pedro, aka Pedro the Cruel, and a lot of records confuse who is who. So Pedro the Cruel that we know from Inez and Pedro was the king of Portugal. Pedro the Cruel, king of Castile, was a whole other guy, also called Pedro. There was also a third, like just to make this complicated, a third Pedro running around at this time who's king of Aragon. So just like so many Pedros in general. It's like little boys now called what? Like Owen or whatever. It's just like everyone is called Pedro at this point. So this is not Pedro from Pedro and Inez, but this was happening at the same time as Pedro and Inez was happening, I think. Let me double check my timeline. Yeah, Inez de Castro was killed in 1355, and this Pedro the Cruel started being the king of Castile in 1350, so like literally the same time, but not the same guy as Pedro and Inez. So it's interesting because like Pedro from Pedro and Inez, who is aka Pedro the Cruel, but also aka Pedro the Just, it's like, it's not like a Vlad the Impaler thing where you're like, okay, he has that name because he is, you know, kind of a horrific in battle person. This Pedro the Cruel was actually kind of Pedro the okay. He was fairly sympathetic to the Jewish population of Portugal. But he was enemies with his brother, of Castile. We're looking at Castile, which is one of those places that later on merged into Spain. Pedro the Cruel, king of Castile, was okay to the Jews. So, but he was enemies with his brother Enrique of Trastamara, who is aka Enrique the Fratricidal, which, if you know that fratricide means kills your brother, then spoiler, that is how this Pedro is going to die, killed by his brother. Enrique then took over as king, but even before he took over as king, he killed something like 1,200 Jewish people in 1355. He ordered a Jewish massacre in 1360 and was involved in the murder of many other Jewish people in 1366. As one might expect, given that that's his track record, when Enrique the Fratricidal became king of Castile, Jewish people lost their royal protection, and because the new king was so violent towards them, the common people of Spain started to accept violent anti-Semitism as just like the way that things were and the way that things should be. But Jewish people were still too important financially to be completely annihilated at this point. So, during the reign of Enrique the Fratricidal, this guy who's like real asshole named Ferrand Martinez was running around. He was like an archbishop or something. He was giving awful speeches, just like saying terrible things about Jewish people. And that just really worked up people into being even more anti-Semitic, such that in 1391, one of the Middle Ages' largest attacks on Jewish people took place across both Aragon and Castile. The number of Jewish people murdered might have been as high as 50,000 in this series of violent attacks. So the attacks began in Sevilla, a place we've talked about in other stories. So thousands of Jewish people were murdered there. The Jewish people who survived generally converted due to their fear of being killed. And this pattern of violence occurred again and again throughout the country. And by the country, I mean like the Iberian Peninsula, like Castile, Aragon. So within 3 months, in over 70 other towns, Jewish people faced a choice of either converting or being murdered. Or I guess leaving would be a third option. So these terrible events were nothing new. Frankly, I had said things had been kind of shitty for Jewish people in Spain for a while. During the 12th and 13th centuries, many Jewish communities throughout Europe were faced with a choice of baptism or death. However, this incident, the one I'm talking about, 1391, the results of this was different because whatever the reason, throughout the Iberian Peninsula, a huge amount of Jewish people chose to convert in order to escape death. I guess in other places, more people died for the cause. So this was different in the sense of suddenly you started having a whole bunch of ex-Jewish people who were secretly still Jewish people, but pretending to be Catholic people. And the number of Jewish people who converted in the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile is thought to be as high as 200,000. Among them, the ancestors of the woman that I promised we're going to eventually talk about, Doña Gracia Nasi. So, enter the Catholic monarchs. So as we discussed substantially in the Isabella of Castile episode, she and her husband Ferdinand were known as the Catholic monarchs. And they were responsible for a lot of things. Notably, they financed Christopher Columbus and kind of kickstarted the conquest of the Americas. And they also set out to do the Reconquista, which was where they were just gonna let's make Spain Catholic again, was what they're doing. So in which they killed and or kicked out and or forcibly converted any non-Catholics from Spain. I mean, just like Asterix, remember what I said before, like Jewish people had been in Spain before Christian people were in Spain, like by several hundreds of years. So, okay. As part of the Reconquista, Ferdinand and Isabella released the Alhambra Decree, in which remaining practicing Jewish people in Castile and Aragon were forced to convert to Catholicism, thus becoming what was known as conversos, or sometimes they're called Marranos. So they were people who used to be Jewish, but now were converted, and they were still discriminated against, but I guess not killed. Those who continued to practice Judaism were expelled. And this all happened at the same time that the Muslims were also kicked out of Al-Andalus, which we talked about in the Sayyida al-Hura episode. Because Sayyida al-Hura, again, referring back to the timeline, yeah, so she was born in 1485. The Alhambra decrees were 1492. So like very, very early in her life, she and her family, as we talked about in an episode, like they fled, they went to Morocco. So Doña Gracia Nasi is who we were talking about today. So her parents' families were kind of like old money from this region. So her father's family were the Nasis, and her mother's family were the Benvenistes, and both families fled as part of a group of 600 wealthy Jewish families who just pieced the fuck out of Spain because they were rich and wanted to still be Jewish, and they could afford to purchase land in Portugal, which is where they went. So these 600 wealthy Jewish families went to Portugal hoping to continue practicing their faith. But 5 years after the Alhambra Treaty, Isabel and Ferdinand pressured the Portuguese king, I don't have his name written down, but let's assume it was Pedro, to do a similar thing. And so Portugal did the same thing, where it's like all the Jewish people like had to convert or leave or be killed, presumably. And so both her family, her parents' family, her mother's family, they were all converted, but like not by choice. So the Nasis changed their last name to De Luna, and the Benvenistes changed their name to Mendes. So, interestingly, forced baptism opened up new opportunities for the conversos to get new jobs, because there were some things that you couldn't do if you were Jewish, but now that they like were officially not Jewish, but like we're going to talk about this, like secretly still Jewish, like they were still like observing the Sabbath and like not eating pork and things. But now that they were quote unquote Christians, they were able to take new jobs, including participating in the rapidly expanding Portuguese spice trade with the Far East, which is a thing we've talked about a bit before. Because remember how Portugal, they were the first country to kind of trade with India, and that's where they learned about chai. And then they were like, oh my God, we love tea. And then the Catherine of Braganza went from Portugal. She married Charles II, and she's like, I love tea. And now everyone in England likes tea, and it's all traces back to this. Anyway, so this was an era of trade with the Far East, but also the Atlantic trade of various things. And so Gracia's maternal uncles, Francisco and Diogo, they were from the Benveniste, changed to Mendes family. They became leading members of a consortium that marketed the annual spice shipment from India and provided vital financial services to the Portuguese crown, aka money lending. So Gracia, our heroine, her parents, so her mother was called Filipa, her dad was called Alvaro, which, if you remember, their last name was changed to De Luna. So his name was Alvaro de Luna. Now, we did already in a previous episode, like in a previous season, talk about a guy called Alvaro de Luna, who is the villain of the Isabel of Portugal story. She was the one who's trapped in the ghost castle. I vaguely remember he did something about throwing somebody out of a window or something. So this was happening at around the same time, but this is a different person, also called Alvaro de Luna. Not the same person. Maybe he chose his name in honor of him. I don't know. So this forced conversion happened to her mother's family, her father's family, and Gracia was born 13 years later in Lisbon, Portugal, and she was baptized because her family was like Christian, and the name that she was baptized with was Beatriz de Luna. But as we've done with previous people in this show, especially in the season, the international season, she's known famously as Gracia Nasi. So we're just going to use that name, even though that was not officially her name as a child. Note that it's possible that she was referred to that internally by her family because Gracia is a Portuguese translation for Hannah, which is a Hebrew name. So, like, we're settling into the story. And as per every episode of this podcast, ? Who knows what happened to her during her childhood and youth. But at age 18, she was married off. And who is she married to? She was married to her uncle, the wealthy pepper merchant, Francisco. So he was known, aka the Black Pepper Baron. So yes, she was married to her adult uncle, her mother's brother. Like, let's just go with it. This is not the only uncle-niece marriage in this story, so just get used to it. So she and her uncle, husband, were married in the Great Cathedral of Lisbon in a public Catholic wedding, but then they had a super secret, sexy Jewish ceremony afterwards, secretly at home, I guess. So she was 18 and married to her uncle, who is this business guy working with his brother Diogo. And honestly, like, kind of like we saw with Said al-Hurra, kind of like Empress Sissi, also like the people who ran the business quickly saw that, like, oh, Gracia is like got a good head on her shoulders. She's got a good business mind. Like, she is like, let's get her involved in this business. She kind of has good ideas. So she became involved in the pepper spice business too. Her husband/uncle was the director of this powerful trading company, as well as a bank of world renown with agents across Europe and around the Mediterranean. And being in Portugal circa the time that Portugal started doing less colonizing, opened up, as I said, lots of opportunities for this business to just expand and do even better. And then 10 years after their marriage, Gracia was 28 years old. Her uncle, husband Francisco, died. In his will, he divided his fortune between his niece/wife and his brother/business partner, Diogo. So I just want to highlight this because bear in mind, Diogo was like a 50-year-old man who is a multi-decade veteran of the spice trade, who had been a leader in Portuguese salt and pepper trading for a really long time. Gracia was 28 years old, and he divided the fortune between the two of them because she was as talented and important as Diogo was, which speaks to her skill. But also, like, her uncle husband, like, you know, thought a lot of her. So she also had one child, a baby daughter named Anna, who had been born a year before Francisco's death. So her business skills are quickly put to the test because a year after Francisco died, the Pope, I didn't write down what name Pope it is. Later, there's a named Pope. But anyway, whoever the Pope was at this point, ordered the establishment of a Portuguese Inquisition based on the Spanish Inquisition, which is like, so the Reconquista was like, let's just find everybody who's not Catholic and like make them be Catholic or kill them. The Inquisition was just like not trusting the people who said they were Catholic and like torturing them, as I understand it. So the Pope like ordered this, but it wasn't his idea. It was actually the idea of the current King of Portugal, João the Pious, who was, just to connect this to other things, João the Pious was the son of Maria of Aragon, therefore the grandson of Isabella of Castile. He hated Jewish people, and that's his deal. And ever since they came to Portugal, which had been 40 years ago, the Nasi family and the Benveniste family, aka the De Luna and the Mendes, have been secretly practicing Jewish people, pretending to be Catholics. If they got arrested by the Inquisition, they would probably be found out for being secretly still Jewish, and then the Inquisition would like take all their money. So they had to figure out a plan to save their business. And who figured out the plan was Gracia. So 28 years old, half business owner of this pepper trading bank. What she did, so Gracia, she grabbed her younger sister, who I haven't mentioned before, but she is going to become important, Brianda. Gracia grabbed her daughter Anna, and they made their way across the continent to a city that you know I have feelings about, which is Antwerp, Belgium, which is where their other pepper uncle, Diogo, was living. So, like, the pepper biz was a pretty big deal. Like, obviously, so they weren't just, it wasn't just based out of Portugal. The pepper biz had offices and agents all over the place, including Diogo, their uncle/brother-in-law, was in my nemesis of a city, Antwerp. So at this time, Antwerp was the leading financial center of Europe. It was under Spanish rule and thus within jurisdiction of the Spanish Inquisition. In fact, Diogo had had a brush with the Inquisition. He had been arrested at one point and released only after intervention by the King of Portugal, João the Pious, who you think, like, why would he intervene when he hated Jewish people? But the thing is, Diogo had loaned him money and owed him, and he needed to keep that relationship going. So, yeah, the resettlement in Antwerp of the Lisbon family, like members of this family, was probably planned to be like a temporary thing. They just kind of went there to just like not be in Portugal, but just to have the time to organize a more permanent trip to a more secure place and also to transfer the family fortune so it wouldn't be taken away by the Inquisition. Once they settled in Antwerp, Gracia invested her family fortune into the business. So I wonder if that's the family fortune from her mother. No, because these were her mother's brothers. So she invested, I guess, her father's money. Anyway, she invested all the money she had into the pepper business. And she started to make a name for herself, not only as Diogo's business partner, but also as an independent businesswoman herself. And then the relationship between the Nasi and the Benveniste household became even stronger because her sister Brianda married their uncle Diogo. So now both sisters had married both brother uncles. I don't know. I hope a political type thing. Just bring the families together. I said this was not going to be the only uncle-niece marriage, and it's not. There's still going to be one more. Anyway, so this money lending / banking business, which was making its money also from the spice trade, was like the connections they had were quite impressive, frankly. I found this really interesting to see, actually. So their important business, like I'd said, that they'd loaned money to João, the king of Portugal, who hated Jewish people, but like still would borrow money from them. Some of the other people who they had loaned money to included King Henry II of France, who is the husband of Catherine de' Medici, the brother of the guy who died at the pillow fight of death, which I talked about on this podcast. They had loaned money to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was the son of Juana La Loca and Philip the Handsome. They also lent money to Pope Paul III and his successor Pope Paul IV. They had also loaned money to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, husband of Harem Sultan. So these dealings involve commercial activities, so I guess maybe involving them in the pepper biz, but also loaning money, also bribing people. Like they were connected. This is like, if you're going to borrow money from somebody, it's like, this is the family you go to. The Mendes / Benveniste family / Nasi family. Like, I found this really interesting. I think at one point later on, I have like, they were loaning money to like Henry VIII in England. Like, it's interesting to me because we've talked so many times about all these kings and like, you know, they're commissioning buildings and whatever. And I just kind of like always assumed that all these people had money because they were kings. But in fact, they didn't. In fact, they had to borrow money, and the people they borrowed money from was Gracia's business. So things are going well business-wise. But just 5 years after they had settled in Antwerp, Diogo, Brianda's uncle husband, died, but not before Brianda also had a daughter, who's named Beatriz, which, if you remember, is Gracia's official Christian name at this point. So in accordance with the will, half the family property remained in Gracia's hands because she had inherited that from her dead uncle husband, Francisco. But Diogo clearly also recognized how much Gracia should really be the one in charge of this, because in his will, he made her the administrator of his half of the fortune on behalf of Brianda and their daughter. So Gracia she owned both halves of the business. Like Gracia owned the whole business. This decision was probably meant to provide the best administration of the estate, like consolidating it all in her hands. Like she clearly knew what she was doing. But Brianda, her sister, who probably thought that she should have inherited half of it, and she maybe kind of should have inherited half of it, was mad about that. And this is going to cause some interpersonal problems between the two sisters. Spoiler alert, Brianda's got a big Claire Claremont from the Mary Shelley episode type relationship with Gracia, and we'll see that play out, including name change. So it is now 1542. Gracia is in control of this commercial empire. And what did she do with this money and all the important contacts all across Western Europe, and the fact that like all of these monarchs and popes were like literally in debt to her? She set up a underground railroad type scenario to help Jewish people escape the Inquisition. So Gracia she was not allowed to live openly as a Jewish person in Antwerp because it was under Spanish control, and like you couldn't be Jewish if you lived under Spanish control. But she used her extensive business contacts to help other Jewish people escape to cities where they could live Jewish lives. So she helped secret Jewish people escape from Portugal and Spain. And to escape like the terrain of Europe, like this is similar to the route that like Hortense Mancini had to take. He had to go over the Alps to Italy or into the Balkans. But she was doing her best to try to help these Jewish people escape with some of their property and wealth to help them start new lives in a new place. So her extensive business contacts hid a network of escape routes throughout Europe. So she was trading spices, but her business agents were also secretly, I don't know if it was a sort of thing where you have like, a big wooden trunk and you're like, yeah, what's inside the trunk? Just like pepper, just lots of pepper, but secret inside the trunk was like people, like Jewish people. So they hid Jewish people in and among these shipments, along with the merchandise that they were shipping. So one popular route was for Jewish people to board Gracia's ships in Spain and Portugal, where they would then go to England. I'm not sure why they have to go to England and then like back around to get to Antwerp, but that was the route. Anyway, so at this point in England, Jewish people technically weren't allowed. But like when all the Jewish people had left Spain and Portugal, several of them went to England where they were living like, secretly Jewish, but like pretending to not be Jewish. So when the ships docked in Southampton or Plymouth, one of Gracia's London agents, a man named Christopher Fernandez, was instructed to board the ships and let the hidden Jewish people know whether it was safe to stay on board for the next leg of the journey to the Netherlands or not. So I guess he would just like check up, I don't know, give them water, maybe give them some food, and just like let them know, like, should you get off here or can you keep going? Is it safe? Another of Gracia's London agents was a man named Antonio de la Rogna, who was described as a tall Jew with one eye. Now, initially, when I was first researching this, I think as one of the podcasts, they only referred to him as Tall Jew with one eye, and I thought that is a fantastic name. But I want to learn more about it. So if you Google Tall Jew with one eye, you learn that it's Antonio de la Rogna. So, notable looking person. And he was related to Gracia somehow as a cousin or something. And he was a master of theology / also merchant / also conductor on this like underground Jewish railroad. And he was tasked with helping Jewish refugees recover property that they'd been forced to leave behind. So he, with his height and his one eye, that was his job. So like Jewish people would like be smuggled along with pepper over to London where they would be like, made sure they're okay. And then this guy, the tall Jew with the one eye, would help them like get their property back. And then they would go on to the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, many of these people found employment working for Gracia's business in the warehouses or whatever, until they could be dispatched safely further south to Italy or Turkey, which were places where you could live openly as a Jewish person. So her agents would instruct these Jewish people on which roads to use and which inns to stay in. Like it's literally like an underground railroad scenario, right? Where it's just like, this is the safe house, this is not. They relied on a network of sympathetic allies. In Venice, a non-Jewish printer named Daniel Bomberg, he specialized in printing Hebrew books, received the property of the fleeing Jewish people and returned it to their owners once they made it to Italy. So like she had this all figured out. Gracia, like this is why I think at age 18, they're like, guess what? You're going to be like in charge of the business now. Like she figured this out herself. Like there wasn't a roadmap to figure this out. She was just like, here's my privilege. Like in as much as she was wealthy, she had all these connections, and she's like, how am I going to do this to help other people? And she just did. And I just love that. So, but meanwhile, she's still in goddamn Antwerp, and she was getting richer and richer because along with like the secret Jewish Underground Railroad, she was also, spice trading, making interest off of her loans to like the Pope. But she's getting so rich, people are like, I don't like this rich woman because they, like, first of all, people don't like a rich woman, like an unmarried rich woman. Second of all, like they knew that she like was a converted Jewish person. So like, ooh, a rich Jewish woman, like no thanks. Emperor Charles V wanted her daughter, remember she had the daughter Anna. He wanted the daughter to marry one of his courtiers, basically so he could then seize the family's wealth. And that's the thing, right? Like part of the whole Inquisition Reconquista situation was that the Catholic monarchs could then seize all the money from the Jewish people and like claim like now it's ours. So Emperor Charles V just wanted her money. People saw this like wealthy, like former, like as far as I knew, former converted Jewish woman, and they were just like, we want that money. Like she's so rich. People are just like, how can we get the money? Oh, I know, we'll marry the daughter. So she knew that this was happening and like things were getting a bit too dangerous for her to stay there. So she said that she was just going to go to visit a spa in France. But in fact, what she did is she and her daughter fled with as much property as they could carry. And like they went to France, but not for a spa. From France, then she traveled on to Italy, I guess using her same connections and, secret safe inns. And she eventually settled in Venice, where she reestablished her trading business because she still had all her money and like she's a business lady and here's what's happening. So we talked about Venice, or actually, no, I think that was more Rome. But do you remember in the Christina of Sweden episode, there was a thing like Jewish people who lived in Venice had to or who lived in Rome, there's like a special area where they had to live. And then there was some sort of like fucked up like tradition where like bulls would chase Jewish people through the streets or something. And Christina was like, how about we stop that? And I think they might have. Anyway, a similar thing was happening in Venice. So you could live as a Jewish person openly in Venice, but you had to live on this island called the ghetto. So she was still like, rather not live there. So she still didn't reveal her Jewishness publicly because this would have meant an end to her business, basically. And in fact, it looks like she was arrested and held in prison briefly in Venice, accused of being secretly Jewish. And she got out of jail, I'm going to assume. Bribery was involved and her friends in high places. But then she began a super secret sexy plan to transfer her wealth to Turkey with an eye to eventually living there because, as I mentioned before, Turkey was it was like the main HQ of the Ottoman Empire, which was the Muslim empire where Jewish people could live as long as you paid taxes. And who was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at this point? Literally, Suleiman, the husband of Hürrem Sultan. In fact, at the point this was all happening, he had pretty recently just married Hürrem Sultan. So these two powerful women living in the same continent at the same time. Fun fact, in fact, Gracia Nasi does have a 6-episode arc on the Turkish soap opera 16th Century, all about Hürrem Sultan. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. So they're there as well. And this is her plan, to go to Turkey where she could just be a Jewish girl boss. So her life in Venice was precarious. Her sister, Brianda, which, like, side note, if you watch Grace and Frankie on Netflix, I think Brianna is the name of this character played by June Diane Raphael. And so whenever I read about a sister called Brianna, I just picture her. Anyway, like, Brianda is coming in hot with like a real Claire Claremont sort of energy. She's still mad about how Gracia inherited all the businesses. Would Brianda have been good at running the businesses? Like, part of me is like, maybe give Brianda a shot. But part of me is just like, no, like, if she'd been good, like, then her husband would have like made her inherit some of it instead of giving it all to Gracia. Like, maybe she would have been fine, but Gracia was like so good at it. Anyway, in a real, all I can describe this as a Rolf from Sound of Music moment, Brianda revealed to the authorities in Venice that Gracia was still secretly practicing Jewish traditions. Brianda, what are you doing? I want to support you, Brianda, just like in this Claire Claremont way, or myself as a younger sister intrinsically want to support the Lydia Bennetts of the world, the Amy March of the world. But Brianda, like, what are you doing? Like, she turned in Gracia as being secretly Jewish, but it's like, Brianda, like, you're also secretly Jewish. You're her sister. Like, how did you think this was going to go? And this is where I'm like, Brianda probably shouldn't have inherited the business. Anyway, so Brianda revealed to the authorities of Venice that Gracia was still secretly doing Jewish stuff. To avoid being punished and having all of her money and business taken away, Gracia fled with her fortune to the Italian town of Ferrara. She also took her daughter, Anna. She also took Brianda and Brianda's daughter with her. Like, this is a real, like, when they go low, we go high type moment, because she took Brianda with her. Like, what a mess. Anyway, good for her. Gracia, very forgiving. So, why do they go to the city of Ferrara? Not a place that I've read about before, not a place we've talked about on this podcast. But the city of Ferrara was happy to accept the family. So the Duke of Ferrara was a person named Ercole II. He was the son of Lucrezia Borgia, who I have not talked about on the podcast, but that's a very frequent suggestion, so perhaps one day. But his name is Hercule, like Hercule Poirot. So, I had to go look up an image search of him. Hercule II did have a mustache. It was part of a whole beard, but I feel like if your name is Hercule, like, you have to have a mustache. So he was just like, this is great. Like, you are like an incredibly wealthy, powerful, connected family, and you want to move into my city? Like, yeah, please come here. Like, rich people, come here, pay your taxes, love it. So wherever I got this from, one of my sources says that he received them gracefully in 1549. Ferrara. So this is a place where, because this is like, Italy's not a country, but there's all these places. There's Venice, there's Rome, like Ferrara is like one of these other sort of places where you could be a Jewish person. So for the first time in her life, Gracia Nasi was able to openly like be a Jewish person. So there was a distinguished Sephardi Jewish community in Ferrara. This city also recognized her rights. And this is where she officially changed her name, or she started referring to herself as Gracia Nasi instead of Beatrice de Luna. And around the same time, there's a mass name change of everyone else in her family. So Brianda changed her name to Reina, which is the Spanish or Portuguese version of the Hebrew name Melka, which means queen. Like Brianda, like Brianda. Okay. Gracia's daughter Anna took on the name Reina as well. Brianda's daughter, who was previously known as Beatrice, changed her name to Gracia. So now we literally have two Gracias and two Reinas. But they're not, the Gracia is not the daughter of the Gracia, the Reina is not the daughter of the Reina. So just to keep everything straight. And like even then, they were like, how are we going to keep track of all this? So our Gracia, we're just going to call Gracia. Her niece, Brianda, now Reina's daughter, was known as Gracia la Chica, which means Gracia the girl. So, while in Ferrara, Gracia supported local Jewish scholars because she's like hugely wealthy, right? Like she has retained her wealth. Like every time she was like, someone's going to steal my money, I'm just going to like peace out of town with all my money using the Underground Railroad I invented. So she supported local Jewish scholars and paid for the first translation of the Torah into Spanish. But this calm-esque nice period was short-lived. So they moved there in 1549. 2 years later, 1551, the constant companion of this podcast / to all of history, the plague broke out in Ferrara. And then although Ferrara was like cooler than other places to Jewish people, they were just like, the plague is here. And they were just like, well, I guess it must be because Jewish people live here. It must be like Jewish people brought the plague, which is part of what the anti-Semitism in Spain and Portugal was to begin with. It's just like whenever anything happened, it was just like, well, this must be because of Jewish people. Like just the way the prejudice works. Anyway, this happened and all the Jewish people were forced to leave Ferrara. And Gracia was just like, fuck this noise. And she set sail for Istanbul, in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a place where she knew that like they were not going to kick her out and she could just like live and thrive. Side note. Yeah. Oh, this is great timing. Actually, my cat Hepburn is here because I'm talking about cats Hepburn. So this whole past season, the International season, I've been following on Instagram just like accounts of people talking about the cities that I talked about just because I want to learn what they look like. And when I read the history, I want to keep up with them. And something I've learned is that Istanbul, the cats of Istanbul are like a whole thing. There's cats. I feel like maybe I talked about this on the podcast before, but I will never tire of talking about it. The cats of Istanbul, like some people call it Catstanbul. Like there are cats in the street and the people there love them. There's like cats who are like in the mosques. There's like official mosque cats. There's like this statue of a cat that people love because the cat was so cute. It like sat sideways. So she moved to Istanbul, which is like great for her for all these reasons, not cats. Like it's great for her because the whole like religious tolerance situation, but also Istanbul, one of my favorite places that I want to visit one day because of the cats. Anyway, so she moved to Istanbul. Gracia set up a fine household, again living openly and proudly as a Jewish woman. And she continued to run her trading empire and like she was still this whole time, like even as she was like going through it, she was still keeping up with the whole like secret underground railroad, ferrying Jewish people to freedom. But for the first time in Istanbul, she was able to not just secretly be helping Jewish people, but she could publicly support Jewish people and Jewish organizations. So this is where we're getting into a real philanthropy moment. And this reminds me of kind of some of the work that Hürrem Sultan ended up doing as well, like where she helped women and girls and stuff. So each day. So Gracia was living in what is described here as a grand palace in Istanbul. And I think like she moved there, like she had been loaning money to Suleiman. Like they were cool with each other. He respected her. So she set up in a grand palace in Istanbul. Every day, 80 poor people entered her grand palace for free meals. So she paid to liberate enslaved Jewish people who had been seized by pirates. When Turkey experienced a bitterly cold winter in 1567, she paid to help the empire's poor Jewish people afford heat and clothes. She also used her wealth to support hospitals, charities, schools, and synagogues throughout the Ottoman lands. One of her favorite projects was a synagogue and yeshiva she established in the heart of Istanbul, which was known as the Synagogue of the Senora. Oh yes, by now at this point. So Gracia just became, and she sometimes referred to this as just La Senora, which just means like the woman. Like that's how major she is. And the synagogue she established was called the Synagogue of the Senora. Previously, local tradition dictated that Istanbul's Jewish people always prayed in the one synagogue to which their families belonged. Like you couldn't just go to whichever synagogue was close to you. Like your family was connected to just one specific one. But the Synagogue of the Senora was different. It was open to all Jewish people, welcoming everyone, whether they were member or not. Eventually, the thing with her and Brianda settled. So she briefly went back to Venice to settle with her sister in the Venetian Senate Brianda's whole thing was just like for control over the business. So visiting Turkish emissary mediated between the sisters and negotiated an agreement, which was ratified by the Venetian Senate. So according to the agreement, Gracia handed over 100,000 gold ducats to the Venetian public treasurer for safekeeping until Reina's 12-year-old daughter, Gracia la Chica, reached the age of 15. Reina/Brianda received a relatively modest sum as a dowry and compensation. So if you put the best spin on this, Brianda/Reina just wanted the best for her daughter. She wanted her daughter to have an inheritance, and now she did. But meanwhile, so Reina did not go with Gracia to Istanbul. She remained in Venice with her daughter, and that's why the money was kept in safekeeping in Venice. So much like happened with Gracia's daughter, a lot of people wanted to marry Reina's daughter, especially her daughter Gracia La Chica, because of the whole, like, then you could, whether you're going to like steal her money or you just want to marry her because she was rich, a lot of people wanted to marry her. And so to try and save her, the sisters, like Reina and Gracia, they had a nephew named Joao, who was their mother's brother's son. Anyway, so Joao, aided by his brother Bernardo, basically ran off with Gracia La Chica and hastily married her to try and like save her from having to marry anybody else. So now we've got, sorry, I think I said it was going to be another niece-uncle marriage, but this is actually, what would this be? So it's a cousin marriage because Joao is Gracia's nephew. So it's a cousin marriage. Her nephew, but it's not a nephew-aunt marriage. Anyway, the Venetian authorities learned about this, intervened, and had Gracia La Chica returned to the mother in Venice. Joao tried to have the marriage recognized, but like it had never been consummated. It was pretty easy to get out of it. Frankly, he wanted to get the fortune returned to him, but I think in a good way. Like I think he's an okay person. Anyway, after lengthy proceedings, Joao was banned from Venice. Gracia Nasi was just like, can nobody do anything except for me? Clearly, no. So she sent a ship to fetch him and his brother Bernardo, and they came to Istanbul. So after arriving in Istanbul, Joao assumed the Hebrew name Joseph Nasi and married Gracia Nasi's daughter, Reina. So he didn't marry the one cousin of his, but married the other cousin. Anyway, but I think this is kind of like a business marriage thing, at least in part because Joseph then became Gracia's trusted partner in the family business, and he secured a powerful place at the court of Suleiman. So like they're just like these Suleiman, the Nasi like family, like they're just good. They're like business companions, maybe friendly. And in fact, Gracia's daughter, Reina Nasi, in time became a forceful figure in her own right, known for her support of charitable works. But Gracia Nasi maintained a unique reputation as the very embodiment of passionate solidarity among exiled Jewish people, kind of everywhere. So, one of the most ambitious of her interventions on behalf of Jewish people was when she led the boycott of the port of Ancona in 1556, which is one of the rare acts of organized Jewish resistance to persecution in this era. So, Ancona is another Italian town. So for 2 decades, people from the Iberian Peninsula, like Jewish people who had been forcibly or like had to say that they had converted, the conversos, but they were secretly still Jewish, they were able to go to Ancona, this Italian town, which was under papal rule. So it was the Pope / the Vatican somehow was overseeing it. And when you lived in Ancona, this is like quite a situation, and that's like a whole other rabbit hole to go down. But for some reason in Ancona, the Pope gave consent that you could be Jewish there and you'd be protected from the Inquisition when you lived there. The popes who granted this did so in order to encourage trade between Ancona and the Ottoman Empire, a task for which Jewish people from Portugal were particularly well suited. This all comes down to trade, doesn't it? Anyway, so they were just, I guess the popes were like, well, we need somehow to trade. So let's make this one city that's like okay for Jewish people to live in so we could trade with the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, not surprisingly, 4 agents of Gracia Nasi were counted among the Jewish merchants active in this city. But in May 1555, a new pope took over, which was Paul IV. He was really anti-Semitic. 2 months after taking over, he took sudden action against the Jewish people in Ancona. He overrode the guarantees that the previous popes had provided for them. He initiated the Inquisition against them. The entire community of Portuguese Jewish people in Ancona was placed under arrest. When Gracia heard about this over in Istanbul, she went to her friend, Sultan Suleiman, to see if he would intervene diplomatically. And so Suleiman sent an envoy with a letter demanding the release of the arrested Jewish people. He claimed them to all be under Turkish protection. But this asshole Pope, Paul IV, agreed only to turn over their confiscated property, but not the people. Some of these prisoners were able to escape, apparently using bribery. but more than 50 were tried and convicted. And then in the spring and summer of 1556, 24 of these people were burned at the stake, including a man called Jacob Masso, who was Gracia's agent in Ancona. So, as a protest and as punitive measure, some of the arrested merchants initiated the idea of a Jewish commercial boycott of Ancona and a diversion of the Ancona commerce to another place called Pesaro. So they were like, if this shit is happening in Ancona, let's just like not fuck with them. Let's just like not trade with them. Like, let's just do an let's make them stop or make them suffer for what they're doing to Jewish people by just like not trading with them anymore. But to carry out a boycott of an entire city, this required organization. And it was really only the Nasi family that had the means and the activist spirit to make this happen. So Gracia and her nephew/son-in-law, Joseph, exerted pressure for the boycott. Like, they went around Istanbul, like getting the people of the Ottoman, like the Jewish people in the Ottoman Empire to agree with this. But there were delicate issues involved, and it was hard for people to agree to this. It was a tricky situation. And the question about whether to support the boycott or not divided the Jewish rabbis and communities in the Ottoman Empire, and just kind of without able to really galvanize behind the plan, the boycott, it just fizzled out. It kind of didn't really get going. But just in another side note, whatever happened to Gracia La Chica? So this is Gracia's niece, Reina/Brianda's daughter. Shortly before this whole Ancona situation was happening, so Gracia La Chica, who is still living with her mother, Reina, in Venice, came of age, which means that she was now eligible to inherit her half of the business or her half of the business's money. But only months later, after she came of age, she and her mother were banished from Venice after an inquisitorial investigation discovered that Reina had been keeping hidden in her home a Jewish agent of the business, of their company, the pepper company. So in early 1556, this is really around the same time as the Ancona situation was happening, Reina and her daughter, Gracia La Chica, moved with their possessions to Ferrara, but shortly after arriving, Reina died unexpectedly, leaving Gracia La Chica now an orphan. So it's quite a life she's led thus far. And remember, she's not the one who had been kidnapped and then married to her cousin. She's still a lot's happened to her, but she's not yet married to a relative. Yet, ... So at this point, Joseph Nasi's brother, Bernardo, who had also by now taken on a Hebrew name, Samuel Nasi, arrived in Ferrara. And after a year's mourning had passed for Reina, he was married to his cousin, Gracia La Chica. So it's really a weird parallel. Gracia, the main Gracia, and her sister Reina/Brianda, they were sisters who married brothers who were also their uncles. And then their daughters married brothers who were also their cousins. Anyway, this is why at the beginning I said let's not focus on that. It's just a lot of family marriage, and that's just what's going on. Nothing's ever going to be as weird as the Cleopatra story in terms of incestual marriages. Anyway, and this was okay. Gracia La Chica's previous, quote, marriage to Joseph Nasi was not regarded as valid by anyone. Was that her? I thought that was Reina. Anyway, so they were married, and then they had to Gracia had to talk with a sultan and stuff to use some diplomacy so that the Duke of Ferrara would allow Samuel and Gracia La Chica to depart for Istanbul with all of her money, which eventually they did. Good. This whole family is good negotiators. So in 1558. And then kind of the next thing that Gracia really focused on was this place called Tiberias. I think it's a town, or it was a town technically. So it's on the Sea of Galilee. It's called Tiberias, and it had been a major Jewish center 1,000 years before Gracia was on the scene. Fun fact, Tiberias, the place, had been founded originally in ancient times by Herod Antipas, who, if you know your Jesus Christ Superstar the musical and or the Bible, so Herod Antipas is not the Herod from the Nativity story who hunted down little baby Jesus, but he is the Herod from Jesus Christ Superstar the musical, the one who sings the song, Herod song, the one that's you are the Christ, etc. So Herod was loyal to the Roman Empire, and that's part of why in the whole story of Jesus, he's turned over to the Romans by Herod. Anyway, Herod founded the city, and he named it Tiberias after the person who was the Roman emperor at that time, who I think was the Roman emperor at this time, or just a Roman emperor who he really liked. And this emperor Tiberius was the Roman emperor just before Caligula. Caligula being the brother of Agrippina, who we talked about in like season 2 of this podcast. Tiberius as a person, to quote myself from that episode about Agrippina, Tiberius was worse than useless. Everybody hated him because he was overly serious, overly pious, and had a tendency to run away and hide out on distant islands rather than do emperor-y stuff. So that's the city, Tiberias. And Gracia was like, you know what, Tiberias, like it had been a Jewish like center like 1,000 years ago. So let's make this, like let's make it a Jewish center again. Like let's make it a safe place for Jewish people fleeing persecution to go and live and thrive. So, I mean, what helped her in this situation was that this area where Tiberias was already under the control of Suleiman, her pal, as part of the Ottoman Empire. So she asked, and he gave her tax collecting rights in Tiberias and its surrounding villages. And he also gave her a permit to establish Jewish autonomy there. So this whole project was a mixed success at best because, you know, people lived there already. Local Muslim people resisted sometimes violently to attempts to rebuild this city. Plans were made for Jewish people to move from parts of Italy, but when the Ottomans went to war with the Republic of Venice, that plan was abandoned. By the end of the century, so like she started this in like the mid 1500s, so by 1596, kind of at its height of this project, the village of Tiberias had 54 households, 50 families, and 4 bachelors, and all the people living there were still Muslims. And then 64 years later, in 1660, the Tiberias was destroyed by a group called the Druze, and this resulted in the abandonment of the city by its Jewish community. But unlike Tiberias, the nearby city of Safed recovered from the destruction and wasn't entirely abandoned, remaining an important Jewish center in the Galilee. But anyway, this was Gracia's like kind of final project, was really trying to like make Tiberias into this kind of place where Jewish people could just go and thrive and not have to like always have to be on the run. And she also had a promise to keep. So way back before her husband, Uncle Francisco, had died, she promised that she would do everything in her power to see that he was buried in like Jewish holy lands. So now, like that she had control of this area of Tiberias and it was a very complicated situation to do. She had his body removed from the church graveyard in Lisbon, because I guess he had died still as like pretending to be a Catholic person. So then his body was in fact able to be reburied in Tiberias. And although she commissioned and had a grand home built for herself there, Gracia never actually got to go herself because she became ill. I'm not sure with what, but we've done enough episodes. We know the illnesses that were going around at that point. She withdrew from public life, like she was not well. And eventually she died in Istanbul in 1569, aged 59. And then her nephew, son-in-law, Joseph, kind of kept the Tiberias project going for as long as it did. And so she was La Signora. Like her death was like a lot of people really affected by this, like emotionally. Tributes were delivered throughout Europe and the Middle East. One of the most famous tributes was a poem written by a Jewish poet called Saadia Longo, who had fled the Spanish Inquisition as a child and moved to Salonika with his family, where he witnessed her generosity and her help for the fellow Jewish people firsthand. So he wrote a piece called Doña Gracia of the House of Nasi, and he compares Gracia's passing to some of the major calamities in Jewish history. He says, quote, "She straightened the path in the wilderness, the passage to an awesome God." So getting into her legacy, Gracia Nasi was directly responsible for protecting, sheltering, and smuggling thousands of Jewish people to safety and freedom, coaxing Jewish culture and faith to flourish anew through her extensive charitable commitments. So when she died, like so many people we've talked about on this podcast, like yet again, she was not talked about a lot after she died. And she remained apparently hardly known for the subsequent 500 years, like after she died. Like she did all this amazing stuff and it's just kind of forgotten, not written about. But like clearly her story was being shared, if not in any major way, like the legend of her, like the poet wrote, like all the people who she affected, like shared her story and what she did. And then, so the first known published book about her was released in 1969. And since then, there's been more scholarship about her, like people looking up just, historical documents and papers to track what she did and who she was. And her story of bravery and of supporting Jewish people spread through Jewish communities and all the places she lived and the places where their descendants wound up. So that includes in New York City in 2010, they designated Doña Gracia Day in June 2010, followed by a similar proclamation in Philadelphia a year later. I believe the Jewish community in Turkey is still, she's remembered very fondly there. I think the synagogue she built are still around. And the Turkish government sponsored a Doña Gracia evening in New York City, and they also sponsored an exhibit about her in Lisbon. There have been lectures, articles, and festivals in her honor all over Europe. This is all post-1969. I like this detail. An Italian white wine has been named after her. And again, as I mentioned before, in the TV series 16th Century, she is on for 6 episodes. So, time to get into some scoring for Doña Gracia. The first category, and it's not a straightforward thing. Scandaliciousness, she did marry her uncle, but that was not scandalous to anyone around. What's scandalous about her is all of her the secret underground Jewish railroad, the fact that she was secretly Jewish and did so much stuff for so many people. Had she every time she was almost caught, she had to flee the country. People wanted to capture her for what she was doing. So it's scandaliciousness in a different way from other episodes we've talked about. It's more scandalous. It's kind of more like a Manuela Sands thing where she was doing all this stuff for social justice reasons. The stuff she was doing, a lot of people were mad about, but it wasn't not in a sexy way. But I do think the extent of what she was doing and how scandalous it was to be running an entire underground railroad operation for decades, saving people, using her business contacts. It's scandalous now to know about it. If people then her enemies had found out about it, she would have been in so much shit, which to me makes it scandalous. And I'm just going to give her a 10 straight up, because in that context, her actions were, in fact, incredibly scandalous in the sense of being how shocking it would have been to people who didn't agree with her. Her scheminess, and I don't know, I do at times regret my choice of that word for this category, because again, when we're getting into talking about a Jewish woman, I think the word scheminess can have some connotations of stereotypes and stuff. So just a reminder that by scheminess, I mean how smart was she? Her intelligence, how much when she had her back up to the wall did she come up with a good plan? Her resiliency. And I feel this is a 10. This is a huge 10 for her. The fact that by the time she was 28, her husband was I'm just going to leave you in charge, half in charge of this business because you are in your 20s and a woman and really good at business. And clearly she was. And she invented this underground railroad situation. She saw the money and the connection she had. The fact that she never got, this charges never stuck to her. She was arrested very few times for the stuff she was doing that was against the laws of some of the places where she was. But she always got out of it. And she kept doing it. And I think that's just a 10 as well. I feel it's a 10 for significance too. If you look at her, the significance she has to the Jewish community as a heroine, but also the significance of how many people's lives did she save and change by helping them escape persecution, by having them keep their finances intact. Even the fact that as part of her plan, she would give them employment until they could find a better place to go. And then the stuff she's doing in Istanbul, feeding the poor and being welcoming in her synagogue. I think the butterfly wing trickle down effect of her life and works is very significant. So in terms of how high her score is going to be, it really does come down to sexism. And this is also where I've been, especially this season, this past season, the International season, when we're looking at people where there's an intersection of the prejudice that they faced. Sexism, I feel was not a huge thing in her way. If this was antisemitism, how much of that did she face? That would be a much higher score. But in terms of this scale and how we're comparing her against other people, how much does sexism get in her way? And I think that was not really an issue for her. And it wasn't because her husband, uncle, who she married, respected her business acumen. And then it was her half and half with her uncle, brother-in-law. And he also was so impressed by her that he gave her basically full control of the business when he died. She, the sexism did not get in her way because the people who she was around respected her. The fact that Suleiman, he had her back in some ways. He wasn't just at no part of the story was anyone ever like, "Ooh, you're just a woman," and that got in her way. So in the spirit of festive holidays, I want to round up, but I don't think sexism was in the top 10 of challenges that she faced in her life. So I'm going to give her an average sexism bonus score of just 5 because I think she's great and I want to give her as high a score as possible, which gives her a score of 35, which puts her in the top 10. One of the projects I hope to do in my upcoming hiatus from this podcast is to perhaps finally make a website where you can see the scale, the Fredegund Memorial Scandalicious scale, instead of just me like saying it out loud to you every now and then. But let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's a tie, actually. So she's in the top 10 in the sense that there's 3 people who all have 35, and they're tied at the bottom of the top 10. So if we're doing the top 10, but again with a 3-way tie for 10th place, it's Dowager Empress Cixi, Doña Gracia Nasi, and Zheng Yisao, all of a 35. Queen Min has a 35.5, Malinzin 35.5, the Chevalier d'Eon 35.5, Harem Sultan 36, Njinga 36, Manuela Sanz 37, and then Queen Margot 37.5, Fredegund 38. So that top 10, which like asterisk comprises 11 people, almost all are people from this super special, but then also from the Internationale season, which is great to see. You know, I'm just comparing these people on the podcast on these 4 categories to see where they all go. But I do appreciate that there's people from so many different cultures and ethnicities and religions who are all tits out to the extent that they're in the top 10. So I want to let you all know what is happening with this podcast in the new year. We are going to take a couple weeks off because it's hiatus time. It's seasonal holiday time. And frankly, I'm really tired. So I had planned the International season to be like 12 episodes or maybe 16 or 20. And you got something like, when you had all the super specials, like 44 episodes. So like, it's been fun. It's not a hardship. Like, you're welcome. It's been fun. But over this past year, there's been a lot of new members have joined as listeners, as members of the Tits Out Brigade. And if you're all caught up with the show, this would be like, if you just listen to it all at once, like this might be your first experience of like, I go on hiatus. So rest assured, I'm not planning to take like 5 months off or whatever I've done between previous seasons because various reasons, and I have lots to talk about. But I will be taking off at least a month to refuel and rest up and prepare for season 6, which is going to be coming. I even have sort of an idea for what season 7 will be. Like, the show is going to go on. Don't worry about that. It's just going to be a bit of a little petite break. But other than taking a few weeks off, during the hiatus, I am in the works planning a bunch of super special episodes, which will be like, people will be joining me, like guests. So some are going to be authors who have books coming out or that have come out about women in history. Some we've talked about on the show and some who we're going to learn about. Other fun guests who are people who know stuff about women in history. So for the next little while, after a few weeks off, there's going to be some super specials, but there may not be episodes like every week, but at least every couple weeks, there's going to be something. So just make sure you're subscribed or you're following or whatever on your podcast app to make sure you notice when new super specials pop up. And I'll always be posting about them on the Instagram page as well when that sort of stuff, when those things are coming. That's Instagram, we're at Vulgar History Pod. Yeah, I also wanted to shout out Christina Lumagi, who jumped on board as editor midway through the Internationale season and whose help has been so necessary. I don't want to be like, she's like volunteered her time. I'm like, I am paying her. I hired her as an editor, and it's been such a great help for me because just so I could see the season through, like Internationale. 3/4 of the way through, I was just like, I had so many more stories I wanted to tell, but I was just getting like on the precipice of burning out. But like having her jump in and help out with the editing has really, really helped out because there's a lot of stuff that goes into making a podcast. My favorite things are researching, which friends of the podcast, Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson could explain to you when I'm researching someone who I'm excited about, like the amount of random like screenshots and texts I send to them both to just be like, you'll never believe this. Guess what? Like, I love learning things. I love the research process. I really enjoy recording. And then I really enjoy after the episodes come out, to follow up with a Tits Out Brigade on Instagram or on TikTok and see what your thoughts are and just discuss these like fun stories. So not doing the editing myself has freed up a lot of time doing a task that is not my favorite thing. And so thank you so much to Christina for helping out. And Vulgar History is now part of the Realm podcast network, which is also a huge help and also great news. So I want to explain what that is because like there's podcasts I listen to that are on networks and I don't always know what that means. But what this means for me and for you, the show is still going to be, it'll still sound the same. It's still me sitting at my kitchen table with my cat running around, eating things. I'm still going to have full control over like who I talk about and when I release episodes and all that sort of stuff. You're still going to be able to listen to the show in all the same ways you can. But it means, again, like some of the podcast behind the scenes work that used to take up my time, now the people at Realm are going to help out with. So stuff like finding advertisers, but also finding ways to advertise Vulgar History to find new listeners. And that frees up even more of my time to work on new episodes, which is why I don't think it's going to be like a 5-month hiatus because like we've got a team now, which is just so fantastic. And this all happened this past year. So really, really grateful for that. So it's all win-win-win. Like people are helping out, gives me more time to do more episodes. So you'll have more episodes to listen to. It's all good. All that being said, so there's going to be like over the next little while, some super specials with special guests. And in the background, I'm going to be working on getting ready for season 6. And I do want to let you know, here's your little festive holiday tits out treat. What's coming up? So season 6 is going to be a whole season about a much requested person who is Mary Queen of Scots. So I really didn't want to do this. I think I've said in a couple past episodes, like if I was going to do Mary Queen of Scots, like I have so much to say and there's so much to talk about. Like I want to do it right. I want to be able to do it thoughtfully. And I think I figured out a way to do it, which is, so it'll be similar to the Jane Grey season, How to Lose a Queen in 9 Days. It's going to be a deep dive into the whole Mary Queen of Scots scenario, looking at her life. And there's going to be multiple episodes just her, because a lot happened that's just her. But also episodes about the women who were around her, the women who influenced her and who influenced what happened to her. And if you know her story, you know who some of those women might be. And those are also going to be really scandalous, probably multi-part episodes. But like, you know, I hope you know, Mary Queen of Scots is my girl. And I think I'm at a place now where I can do her story the justice that I feel like I want to do. Yeah, so there's going to be super specials while I work on getting that ready. And until that season starts, really all I can recommend is just that you watch all the episodes of all the seasons of Reign, because it's the greatest show ever made. And it's about Mary Queen of Scots. And some of it is stuff we'll be talking about on the podcast. So finally, I want to thank each and every one of you out there in the Tits Out Brigade, because the reason I keep doing more episodes and the reason why the international season just got this momentum is because of all the incredible energy and feedback I get from all of you. Like not just, you know, messages you send me in email or DMs or whatever, but also just like seeing the numbers of like how many people listen to each episode and how many people are following the podcast. Just like knowing that there's this beautiful Tits Out Brigade literally around the world is just really making me grateful that so many people are jumping on board this, like what feels to me just like a clown car of a podcast of randomness. I love getting your feedback and ideas of people to talk about. Please know I get a lot of suggestions, which is great. Please keep the suggestions coming. But if you suggest something and I don't do it right away, that's not because it's not a good suggestion. That's just because I've got a lot of suggestions and I want to read up on all of them. Like I've got the world's longest Google spreadsheet of people, and I'm really excited to learn more about them. And I really do intend, as I said at the beginning of the international season, to eventually have done a podcast about somebody from every single country and place where any Tits Out Brigade member is from or their ancestry is from. Anyway, so as per ever, you can reach out to me using, there's a form at vulgarhistory.com. You can email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. I'm on Instagram at vulgarhistorypod, and I'm now on TikTok at Vulgar History. And if you're really going through this like cold turkey ending of the podcast, a couple weeks off, like, and you just need to listen to my voice and you've like already listened to all the episodes, there are so many bonus episodes on Patreon. So if you join for $5 a month, you get access to all the episodes of So This Asshole, Vulgar Peace Theater, which is, so most recently in So This Asshole, Genghis Khan. And on Vulgar Peace Theater, we talked about A Knight's Tale, and there's going to be more of those coming up. And you can keep shopping for Vulgar History merch at vulgarhistory.store, where you can always use code TITSOUT for free US shipping or TITSOUT10 for 10% off. And so I will leave you by saying, Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, happy whatever of the 29 various cultural observances that happen during the month of December. And when I come back, at least in the Western or the Northern Hemisphere, days are going to be getting longer. And whatever you celebrate, I hope you do it with your pants on and your tits out, and I'll talk to you in the new year. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
With your long-forgotten name, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
In the words of the unspeakable language, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
By the spilt blood of the wicked, who walk upon this world, sprouting the words of false idols, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
On the land of the dead harvest, that which brings the earth itself into your service, Yamal, we call upon you.
We call upon you. We call upon you. We call upon you.
Yamal calls upon you.
The Sprouting, a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast by Blighthouse Studio. Find us on your podcatcher of choice.